In 1973, Dean Martin did something on The Tonight Show that shocked everyone in the studio. What happened next became one of the most unforgettable moments in late-night television history, and it all came down to 6 words from Clint Eastwood that nobody saw coming. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson wasn't just a television program in the 1970s. It was the center of American entertainment. If you appeared on that couch, you had arrived. And if Johnny liked you, America liked you. But the show had an unwritten rule that everyone in Hollywood understood. Respect the format, respect the host, and never try to steal the spotlight in a way that made someone else look small. Dean Martin knew that rule better than anyone. He'd been a fixture of American entertainment for decades. The Rat Pack, The Dean Martin Show, movies, music, comedy. He was untouchable, beloved, and he had a stage persona that made him seem loose, playful, careless, like a man who'd had a few drinks and was just enjoying the ride. America adored that version of Dean Martin. But people who knew him understood something the cameras rarely showed. Dean Martin was one of the most calculated performers in the business. Every stumble looked accidental. Every slurred word was timed perfectly. The glass of whiskey he carried around, usually apple juice. Dean Martin, the performer, was a character. Dean Martin, the man, had built over years of careful observation and relentless discipline. He controlled every room he walked into, and he did it with a smile that made you think he wasn't even trying. He'd learned that control early. Dean's real name was Dino Paul Crocetti. He grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants. His father was a barber. They didn't have much money. Dean dropped out of school in 10th grade and worked odd jobs: steel mill, gas station, card dealer. He learned quickly that survival meant reading people, understanding what they wanted to see, giving them a version of yourself that made them comfortable. That skill stayed with him his entire life. By the time he partnered with Jerry Lewis in the 1940s, Dean had perfected the art of looking effortless. While Jerry screamed and mugged for the camera, Dean stood back, cool and detached, letting the chaos happen around him. Audiences loved the contrast, and when the partnership ended in 1956, people wondered if Dean could survive on his own. He didn't just survive, he became bigger than ever. The Rat Pack made him a legend, the Dean Martin Show made him a household name, and his persona, the perpetually tipsy crooner who never seemed to take anything seriously, became one of the most recognizable images in American culture. But beneath that persona was a man who cared deeply about his craft. Dean studied timing the way other actors studied Shakespeare. He watched how audiences responded to pauses, to silence, to the space between the joke and the laugh. He understood that great performance wasn't about doing more. It was about knowing exactly how much to do and when to stop. That's why what happened on The Tonight Show in October 1973 was so unusual. Because Dean Martin, the master of control, did something completely out of character. He lost control. So when Dean Martin walked onto The Tonight Show set on a warm evening in October 1973, Johnny Carson was genuinely happy to see him. Dean was always good television. The band played. The audience applauded. Dean waved, grinned, and settled into the chair beside Johnny's desk with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. And he had. The conversation started the way these interviews always did, light, friendly, nostalgic. Johnny asked about the Rat Pack. Dean told a story about Frank Sinatra. The audience laughed. Everything felt familiar, but something was different that night. Dean seemed a little sharper than usual, a little more focused, and about 12 minutes into the interview, he did something that caught Johnny completely off guard. He turned to the audience and said, "You know who's here tonight? Sitting right over there?" Johnny looked confused. Dean pointed toward the guest area, just off stage, where the next scheduled guest was waiting. The cameras hadn't shown him yet. The audience didn't know who was coming up next. But Dean Martin did. "Clint Eastwood," Dean said, grinning. "The cowboy." The audience erupted. Clint Eastwood in 1973 was a phenomenon. He'd spent years on the television western Rawhide, then exploded into global stardom with Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. A fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, the good, the bad, and the ugly. By 1973, he'd transitioned into directing and had just released High Plains Drifter, a dark, violent Western that critics were still arguing about. Clint Eastwood was cool in a way that felt dangerous. He didn't smile much, didn't talk much, didn't play the Hollywood game the way other stars did. He showed up, did his work, and disappeared. That mystique made him fascinating to audiences, but it also made him a target for a certain kind of old-guard entertainer who thought Clint's whole persona was a little too serious. Dean Martin was that kind of entertainer. Johnny Carson tried to steer the conversation back to Dean, but Dean wasn't finished. "I just think it's funny," Dean said, still grinning. "This guy rides around on a horse, squints at people, and doesn't say a damn word for 2 hours, and somehow that's supposed to be acting." The audience laughed, but it was an uncomfortable laugh. Johnny shifted in his seat. Dean kept going. "I mean, what's the big skill there? Looking tough? I could do that. Johnny, you could do that. We just don't get paid millions of dollars to stand there and look angry." The studio got quieter. This wasn't playful anymore. This was something else. Dean Martin wasn't just making a joke. He was dismantling Clint Eastwood's entire career in front of a live audience, and Clint was sitting just off stage, waiting to come out. People in the studio started glancing at each other. The cameramen didn't know where to point their lenses. Doc Severinsen, the band leader, looked over at Johnny with an expression that said, "Do something." Even Ed McMahon, who usually stayed out of interview segments, leaned forward slightly from his spot at the desk. Something had shifted in the room. Dean was still smiling, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that didn't fit with the lovable drunk character he usually played. And Johnny Carson, who'd hosted thousands of interviews and handled every kind of personality, suddenly looked like a man who didn't know what was about to happen next. Johnny Carson did what he always did when things got tense. He smiled, made a small comment to try to soften the moment, and then called for a commercial break. The cameras cut away. The stage went dark for a moment. And backstage, the producers were scrambling. Nobody knew what to do. Do they keep Clint on the schedule? Do they pull him? Do they ask Dean to apologize? The Tonight Show had hosted thousands of guests, but this kind of moment, one guest openly mocking another before they'd even been introduced, was rare. And it wasn't clear if Dean was joking or if something deeper was happening. One of the producers, a man named Fred DeCordova, who'd been with the show since 1970, walked quickly toward the stage manager. They had maybe 90 seconds before the cameras came back on. DeCordova was known for staying calm under pressure, but even he looked shaken. "Is Clint still willing to go on?" he asked. The stage manager nodded. "He says he's fine." "Did he hear what Dean said?" "He heard everything." DeCordova looked toward the guest area, where Clint was sitting calmly, reading through his notes. No visible reaction. No anger. Just focus. That worried DeCordova more than if Clint had been upset, because a man who showed no reaction was either completely unbothered or calculating exactly how to respond. And from what DeCordova knew about Clint Eastwood, he suspected it was the latter. Johnny walked over to Dean during the break. The exact words of that conversation were never made public, but people on set remembered Johnny's face. He looked concerned. Not angry, Johnny rarely got angry, but genuinely worried that the night was about to go sideways in a way that would be hard to recover from. Dean just smiled. He told Johnny not to worry, said it was all in good fun, said Clint would understand. But Johnny wasn't sure. He'd seen moments like this before. Moments when the veneer of Hollywood friendliness cracked just enough to reveal something real underneath. And those moments rarely ended well on live television. Johnny walked back to his desk. The floor director counted down. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The cameras came back on. When the cameras came back on after the commercial, Johnny made a decision. He wrapped up the interview with Dean quickly, thanked him for coming, and sent him over to the couch. Then he turned to the audience and introduced the next guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, Clint Eastwood." The applause was enormous. Clint walked out from behind the curtain, and the moment he appeared, the energy in the room shifted. He was exactly what you'd expect. Tall, calm, wearing a dark jacket and a neutral expression. He didn't wave to the audience, didn't smile, just walked across the stage like a man who had nothing to prove. He shook Johnny's hand. Then he turned and looked directly at Dean Martin. Dean was still sitting on the couch, grinning. Clint nodded at him. didn't say anything, just nodded. Then he sat down in the chair beside Johnny's desk, and the interview began. Johnny asked about High Plains Drifter. Clint answered in his usual way, short sentences, no exaggeration, total control. He didn't seem rattled, didn't seem bothered. For the first few minutes, it was a completely normal Tonight Show interview. But then Johnny did something that surprised everyone. He brought it up. "You know," Johnny said carefully, "Dean had some interesting things to say about your acting style before you came out." The audience laughed nervously. Clint turned and looked at Dean again. Dean's grin got wider. He raised his hands like he was surrendering, playing the lovable drunk who didn't mean any harm. The audience was still unsure whether this was a bit or something real. Clint stared at Dean for a long moment. The silence stretched out. 3 seconds. 4, 5. In television time, that's an eternity. Johnny started to say something to fill the space, but then Clint turned back to him and spoke. Very calmly, he said, "Dean's a song and dance man." The studio went completely silent. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Clint said it the way you'd mention the weather. Flat. Factual. But everyone in that room understood exactly what those 6 words meant. Dean Martin had just spent 10 minutes tearing down Clint's career, calling his acting effortless and empty. And Clint had responded by reducing Dean's entire legacy, the movies, the music, the Rat Pack, the decades of work, to a single dismissive phrase: song and dance man. Not a serious actor, not a dramatic performer, just a guy who sang and told jokes. The cameras caught Dean's face in that moment, and for just a second, the grin disappeared. His eyes changed. The persona cracked, and you could see the real Dean Martin underneath. The man who'd worked his entire life to be taken seriously, who'd fought to be more than just the funny guy, who'd done dramatic roles and tried to prove he had range. Clint had hit him exactly where it hurt, and he'd done it without raising his voice. Johnny Carson didn't know what to say. He looked at Clint, looked at Dean. The audience was frozen. Doc Severinsen and the band weren't playing. The whole studio felt like it was holding its breath. Ed McMahon, sitting at his spot beside Johnny's desk, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The silence continued. 6 seconds now, 7. Then Clint did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one. And he looked at Dean and said, "I'm kidding." The tension broke. The audience erupted in laughter and applause. Dean started laughing too, pointing at Clint like he'd just been beaten at his own game. Johnny exhaled and made a joke to move the interview forward. The moment passed, but anyone watching carefully could see what had just happened. Clint Eastwood hadn't come out swinging. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't given Dean the fight Dean was looking for. Instead, he'd done something much smarter. He delivered one perfectly aimed sentence that dismantled everything Dean had said, and then immediately softened it by calling it a joke. It was a masterclass in control. Dean Martin had tried to humiliate Clint Eastwood on live television, and Clint had responded by showing everyone in that studio exactly who had the power in that room. The rest of the interview continued without incident. Clint talked about directing. Johnny asked about his next project. Dean sat on the couch, quieter than usual. And when the segment ended, Clint stood up, shook Johnny's hand, nodded at Dean one more time, and walked off the stage. The applause followed him all the way out. Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, the atmosphere was strange. The crew moved quickly to reset for the next segment, but everyone was talking in low voices. What just happened? Did you see Dean's face? Did Clint plan that? The questions circulated through the hallways, the dressing rooms, the production offices. Fred de Cordova stood near the stage entrance, watching as Clint walked past. "That was something," de Cordova said quietly. Clint nodded. "Dean's a good entertainer." "Is that really what you think?" Clint stopped and looked at him. "I think Dean's been doing this a long time, long enough to know better." Then he kept walking. De Cordova stood there for a moment, processing what he'd just witnessed. In his years working in television, he'd seen arguments, feuds, and uncomfortable moments. But this was different. This wasn't two egos clashing. This was one man trying to assert dominance, and another man calmly, methodically, dismantling that attempt without breaking a sweat. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone in that building why Clint Eastwood had become a star. Not because he shouted the loudest or performed the hardest, but because he understood power. After the show ended, the story spread quickly through the Hollywood community. People who'd been in the studio that night called their friends. Producers talked about it at parties. The moment became legend. And the question everyone kept asking was the same. Why had Dean done it? Dean Martin wasn't known for being cruel. He wasn't a bully. He didn't pick fights with other celebrities just for the sake of it. So why had he gone after Clint Eastwood that night? Some people thought it was generational. Dean represented old Hollywood, the era of studio systems, musicals, variety shows, and entertainers who could do everything. Clint represented the new Hollywood, the era of method acting, auteur directors, and stars who built their careers on a single powerful persona. Maybe Dean saw Clint as a symbol of everything that was replacing the kind of entertainment Dean had built his life around. The variety show format was dying. The big musical productions were being replaced by grittier, more realistic films. The stars who could sing, dance, act, and host were being pushed aside by actors who specialized in one thing and did it brilliantly. Dean had built his entire career on versatility. And here was Clint Eastwood, a man who barely spoke on screen, becoming one of the biggest stars in the world. Maybe that stung more than Dean wanted to admit. Others thought it was personal. There were rumors that Dean and Clint had crossed paths before, that maybe something had been said at a party or a private event that had left bad blood between them. Nobody could confirm it, but Hollywood is a small town, and grudges have a way of surfacing in strange places. One story that circulated involved a dinner party at Frank Sinatra's house in Palm Springs, sometime in the late 1960s. According to the rumor, Clint had been invited as a rising star, and Dean had made a comment about westerns being the lowest form of filmmaking. Clint reportedly didn't respond, just nodded and changed the subject. But people who were there said Dean seemed annoyed by Clint's refusal to engage. Whether that story was true or not, it suggested a pattern. Dean liked people who played the game, who laughed at his jokes, who treated him like the legend he was. Clint didn't do any of that. He was polite but distant, respectful but unimpressed. And for a man like Dean Martin, who'd spent his whole life charming people, that indifference might have felt like an insult. But the most likely explanation was simpler. Dean Martin was getting older. By 1973, Dean was 56 years old. The Rat Pack era was over. Frank Sinatra was still performing, but the world had moved on. The kind of variety show Dean had hosted for years was being canceled across the networks. Younger stars were taking over. And Dean, for all his success, could feel the shift happening. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had recently told him about the kinds of movies young people were watching. The Godfather, Dirty Harry, The French Connection. Films that were darker, more violent, more complex than anything Dean had made in his prime. Dean had tried to adapt. He'd taken dramatic roles. He'd worked with serious directors. But the public still saw him as the charming drunk from the Rat Pack. The singer, the comedian. Never the serious actor. Clint Eastwood, meanwhile, was 43 and at the absolute peak of his career. He was directing, producing, starring in massive films. He was the future, and Dean was the past. And maybe for just one night, Dean wanted to prove that the old guard still had teeth, that a Rat Pack legend could still command a room and put a younger star in his place. But Clint hadn't played along. He'd responded with 6 words that exposed the entire game Dean was playing. And then he'd smiled and walked away, leaving Dean sitting on the couch with nothing left to say. In the weeks after that Tonight Show appearance, the story took on a life of its own. Television critics wrote about it, talk shows referenced it, and people who'd watched it that night called their friends to talk about what they'd seen. A writer for TV Guide published a short piece titled "The Night the Cowboy Shot Back," analyzing the exchange as a symbol of Hollywood's changing power dynamics. The article quoted several unnamed sources who'd been in the studio, all of them describing the moment as electric and unforgettable. But Clint Eastwood never mentioned it again. He didn't do interviews about it, didn't bring it up in press tours, didn't turn it into a story he told at parties. That wasn't his style. Clint had always believed that the work spoke for itself, and he wasn't interested in Hollywood drama. When reporters asked him about the Tonight Show appearance in the months that followed, he gave the same answer every time. Johnny's always great. It was a fun show. That was it. No elaboration, no details, just a polite deflection and a move to the next question. Dean Martin, on the other hand, seemed different after that night. He continued performing, continued making appearances, but people who worked with him noticed a change. He was quieter, less likely to make jokes at other people's expense. The playful arrogance that had defined his persona softened. His longtime musical director, Ken Lane, mentioned in a later interview that Dean seemed more reflective in the months after the Eastwood incident. He didn't talk about it, Lane said, but you could tell something had shifted. He was gentler with people. Some people think that moment with Clint Eastwood affected him more than anyone realized. Because Dean Martin was a performer who'd built an entire career on being untouchable, the drunk who never stumbled, the comedian who never missed, the legend who never showed weakness. But Clint had found the weak spot, and he'd done it without even trying. The irony was that Dean and Clint weren't actually that different. Both men had created personas that protected their private selves. Dean hid behind the charming drunk, Clint hid behind the silent tough guy. Both understood that Hollywood was a game, and survival meant controlling your image completely. The difference was that Clint's persona was built for the 1970s, quiet, strong, self-contained. Dean's persona was built for the 1950s, loud, charming, generous with attention. And when those two personas collided on The Tonight Show, only one of them could survive the encounter intact. Years later, when people asked Clint about that Tonight Show appearance, he usually deflected. He'd say he didn't remember it clearly. Or he'd laugh and say it was all just television nonsense. But in one rare interview in the early 1990s, a journalist pushed him on it. Asked him directly what he'd been thinking when Dean Martin made those comments. Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dean was a great entertainer, one of the best, but sometimes people forget that being quiet doesn't mean you're not paying attention." That was all he said, but it was enough, because that's what the whole moment had been about. Dean had assumed that Clint's silence meant he could be pushed around, that the man who barely spoke on screen wouldn't know how to defend himself in a live television environment, that the cowboy persona was all Clint had. But Clint Eastwood had spent his entire career learning how to control a room without saying much. He understood timing, he understood power, and he understood that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is wait for the right moment and then say exactly what needs to be said, no more, no less. 6 words. That's all it took. Dean Martin passed away in 1995 on Christmas Day. The tributes poured in from all over the world. Frank Sinatra, Jerry Lewis, celebrities from every generation. Clint Eastwood didn't make a public statement, but people close to him said he sent a private letter to Dean's family. Nobody knows what the letter said, but those who knew both men believed it was respectful, kind, because despite that one tense moment on The Tonight Show, Clint had never held a grudge. He'd made his point, moved on, and let Dean keep his dignity. That was the real power move, not the 6 words themselves, but what came after. Clint could have embarrassed Dean, could have turned that moment into a weapon he used for years, but he didn't. He let it stay in the past, where it belonged, and in doing so, he proved something Dean had spent his whole career trying to prove, that a true professional knows when to fight and when to walk away. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson aired that episode once, in October 1973, and then it disappeared into the archive. For years, people tried to find footage of it. Clips would surface occasionally, poor quality recordings made from VHS tapes that had been copied and recopied until the image was barely visible. But the full segment was never released officially. Some people think NBC kept it locked away on purpose. Too controversial, too uncomfortable. The network had a policy about moments that made guests look bad. They rarely re-aired them. The Tonight Show was supposed to be fun, light, a place where celebrities came to promote their projects and charm America. Moments of genuine tension disrupted that carefully crafted image. But the people who were in the studio that night never forgot it. And the story kept circulating, passed down from one generation of Hollywood insiders to the next. until it became part of the legend of both men. Dean Martin, the untouchable Rat Pack legend who finally met someone he couldn't charm, and Clint Eastwood, the quiet cowboy who proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is almost nothing at all. The Tonight Show studio is gone now. Johnny Carson retired in 1992. The desk, the couch, the curtain, all of it has been replaced. But the memory of that night remains. And if you ask someone who was there, who sat in that audience or worked backstage, they'll tell you the same thing. They'd never seen anything quite like it. The moment when Dean Martin tried to humiliate Clint Eastwood on live television, and Clint responded with 6 words that left the entire studio frozen. Dean's a song and dance man. Simple, calm, devastating, and unforgettable. If you remember watching The Tonight Show during those years, we'd love to hear about it. Do you remember moments like this, when something unexpected happened and you could feel the tension through the screen? Tell us your memories in the comments below.